Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, and today we're going to talk about the leprechauns and the equinox. It's the time of year for shamrocks, green beer, and tiny bearded men guarding pots of gold. So today we're going to look at the word leprechaun, and I have to tell you, the origin is wilder than you might expect. It involves shoemaking, ancient Rome, wolfmen, and more than one competing theory. Today, a leprechaun is a mischievous Irish elf that will take you to his hidden treasure if you can catch him. A little guy in green with buckled shoes and a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But that's actually a relatively modern image, and the word itself has a long and tangled history. In older Irish tradition, leprechauns were associated with water, not just rainbows, and nobody was dressing them in green. In fact, in the late 1800s, William Butler Yeats, the poet and folklorist, classified leprechauns as solitary fairies and specifically said they wore red jackets. Green, he said, was for the other trooping fairies. So the first theory of how they got the name leprechaun has been backfilled from that modern story because their fortune may come from being the cobbler to the stars, mending the shoes of other fairies who dance so much they're constantly in need of repairs. Or it could be that the leprechauns run around so much themselves they're constantly wearing out their own shoes. But either way, the best time to catch leprechauns is when they're working on a shoe, because that's when they're in one place, and you can find them by the tap, tap, tap of their hammer. And this is the important part. For whatever reason, leprechauns are almost always shown working on just one shoe, not a pair of shoes. Now, brogue means shoe in Irish, and according to the website Irish Myths, Douglas Hyde, the first president of Ireland, who was also a, how cool is this, linguist and folklorist, promoted the idea that the name leprechaun comes from leith brogue, meaning half brogue or half shoe, because it sounds similar and fits the image of a shoemaker working on one shoe. But Etym says this is probably a folk etymology, meaning people reshaped the word's form to match the folklore rather than the other way around. So the one shoemaker story is fun, but most scholars now treat it as a back formation rather than the genuine origin. So now let's go to the explanation you would have found in modern dictionaries for many, many years. This story is that leprechaun goes back to the old Irish word lúcarthán, which meant small body. The lú part means little or small, and the corth part means body, from the same place we get the word corpus, which you often hear me use to mean a body of writing. And then the on at the end, lúcarthán, is a diminutive suffix, so you have a word that's essentially small body with an extra little tacked on for good measure. We really mean it. They're tiny. And it's a tidy explanation, and you'll still often find it in dictionaries. But now there's also a newish competing theory that takes the story in a very different direction. In 2012, Jacopo Bisogni, a researcher at the University of Galway, argued that leprechaun doesn't come from small body at all, that instead it comes from the Latin word luperci. Now, the Luperci were a group of young Roman priests who participated in a festival called Lupercalia, held every February 15th, that was likely connected to the god Lupercus and wolves. Lupus is Latin for wolf. So this was one of Rome's oldest and most famous rituals, and these young Roman men would run through the streets naked, bestowing blessings of fertility on women by hitting them with pieces of animal skins. So how on earth do you get from this weird Roman festival to tiny Irish cobblers? Well, you have to think back to what I said about leprechauns originally being associated with water. First, in the 5th century, St. Augustine wrote that the rampaging Roman men were inspired by earlier Greek stories of men who transformed themselves into wolves by swimming through a lake in Arcadia. Then, centuries later, Irish scholars reading St. Augustine's account got a little confused. They took that idea of men swimming to become wolves and turned it into a legend about an ancient magical race that survived the biblical flood by swimming to Ireland. In medieval Irish legends, the leprechauns, or little luperci, still lived underwater. But eventually the connection to wolves fell away, and then even later the major connection to water also fell away too. So the idea is that the Romans who ran through the streets and the Greek swimming werewolves accidentally merged in the minds of medieval scholars to create a magical, water-loving race, which eventually morphed into our modern leprechauns. Today, you'll find both modern origin stories, the small body story and the Luperci story, alongside each other in the Oxford English Dictionary, Edam Online, and the American Heritage Dictionary. It's a story that isn't settled yet, but since the Irish are famous storytellers, I know they won't have any problem weaving new tales and continuing to delight children, tourists, and more with tales of the leprechauns. The days are getting longer in the Northern Hemisphere, which is definitely improving my mood, and the spring equinox is right around the corner on March 20th. So today, we're going to look at the word equinox because it literally tells you what it means, but it's slightly lying to you and leads to some other fun seasonal words. Our old friend Geoffrey Chaucer was the first person to write down the word equinox around the year 1400, so Middle English. But he didn't use it in the Canterbury Tales. He used it in a less well-known book he wrote about a device called an astrolabe, a tool for doing things like measuring the position of the stars and planets and telling time. It was one of the first technical manuals written in English instead of Latin, and he said he wrote it that way because he wanted his 10-year-old son to be able to read it. The word equinox does go back to Latin, though, and the two parts mean equal and night. And equal night is a nice, tidy description, except that it's not actually true. Day and night are almost equally long on the equinox, but because of some complications about the way we measure sunrise and sunset, the day is actually a little bit longer than the night. Also, the equinox is technically a moment, not the whole day. NASA defines it as the instant when the sun's center crosses the plane of Earth's equator. For 2026, that instant will be on March 20th at 14:46 Greenwich Mean Time in London, or 10:46 a.m. in New York. And if you're remembering last week's show and wondering why I didn't call the time in London UTC time, well, I thought Greenwich Mean Time just sounded nicer. Greenwich Mean Time. It's beautiful. And one more thing before we move on. Before English had the Latin import equinox, Old English speakers had their own word for it, effinixt, which meant nearly the same thing, even night. Now, I had never thought about it before, but Merriam-Webster points out that it seems kind of weird that the names for this point in the year focus on the night instead of the day. People are more likely to be excited that the days are getting longer, so you'd think the names would be more likely to celebrate the length of the day. It has to do with ancient astronomers' fixation on the stars, but it turns out that in modern times we do have a word that celebrates the day, equilux, which means equal light. This word actually is used to describe the day when daylight and darkness are truly the same length, which typically happens a few days before or after the equinox, depending on which equinox we're talking about, because there's one in September, too. The word equilux has been around in engineering circles since the early 1900s, but people only started using it to describe equal day and equal night in the 1980s, so it's much newer than equinox. Next, you'll often hear the March equinox called the vernal equinox, so let's look at that word. Vernal came into English in the 1530s, and it goes back to a Latin word that meant spring. It's the same root that gives us pasta primavera, which gets its name from being filled with springtime vegetables. Of course, calling it the spring equinox or even the vernal equinox only makes sense if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. In Australia or Argentina, March means autumn. That's why some sources now prefer the more hemisphere-neutral name March equinox. It sounds less poetic, but it's also less confusing for a global audience. And thinking more globally, one of the world's oldest continuously celebrated holidays is tied to the March equinox. Nowruz, which is the Persian New Year. Its roots go back thousands of years to Zoroastrianism, and the word itself breaks down into two parts. Now means new, and ruz means day. So Nowruz simply means new day. Finally, here's a fun misnomer to pair with equinox. If you're trying to navigate the old-fashioned way by looking at the sky, the March equinox is tied to something called the first point of Aries, a reference point that essentially marks the starting line for mapping the sky. NASA uses this term in its reference systems documentation, for example. The problem is that this point isn't actually in the constellation Aries anymore. When the system was first created around 2,000 years ago, the March equinox did fall at the beginning of Aries. But because of precession, the very slow wobble of Earth's axis, the point has drifted westward, and it's now in Pisces. But the name has stuck as a traditional landmark, even if the stars have moved on. And it's still drifting. Eventually, the first point of Aries will slide out of Pisces and into Aquarius. And if you're now humming The Age of Aquarius by the Fifth Dimension, you're not wrong. That 1960s song is literally about this astronomical phenomenon and the idea that the precession of the equinoxes is slowly carrying us into the Age of Aquarius, although astronomers do say it's a few centuries away. So to sum up, we have equinox, equal night, but the day is actually a few minutes longer, and we have the first point of Aries, which is actually in Pisces. It's almost enough to make you wonder if daylight saving time was invented to distract us from the truth. Finally, instead of a FAMILECT this week, I have the winner of the National Grammar Day Haiku Contest.
I'm Morgan Kohler, and this is my haiku about my favorite punctuation mark. Semicolon, please. Let's continue this moment. It lives between us.
Thank you, Morgan. That is wonderful, and congratulations. Grammar Girl is a quick and dirty tips podcast. Thanks to all our Grammarpaloozian supporters on Patreon and beyond. You can sign up to support the show and get ad-free episodes every week at patreon.com/grammargirl. And thanks to Maram El-Naguib, Morgan Christianson, Holly Hutchings, Nat Hoops, Dan Feierabend, and Rebekah Sebastian, who always misspells restaurant the first time. And I'm Mignon Fogarty, better known as Grammar Girl. That's all. Thanks for listening.